The village of Holcomb stands on the high wheat plains of western Kansas, in a lonesome area that other Kansans call out there. That's Truman Capote's famous opening sentence of his best-selling novel based on real events, In Cold Blood. The Clutters lived in the exact heart of the Americas. Their harmonious lives, which were filled with social meetings, picnics, and church events, were interrupted one bloody night 63 years ago. Herb, with his wife Bonnie, and two of his four children were killed November 15, 1959, by intruders who entered their home with the intent of robbery. The small community had never experienced such a brutal and pointless crime before. The events inspired Truman Capote to write his true crime bestseller. That novel ushered in an era of nonfiction and cemented Truman Capote as a worldwide best-selling writer, propelling him to household fame and fortune. However, working on this case would change his life and the Holcomb community forever. Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. My name is Joe, the host, and thank you for joining today. And to be frank, I'd have to change my name, but the story today is one that not a single soul requested. I nearly always do episodes on cases that you listening ask to hear about. And back in August, when I was traveling for work, I took a book along with me, because heaven forbid I risk dropping and destroying my phone and being left without entertainment. The airport is impossible without that. So the book was In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, in case you haven't picked up on that by now. It's a story based on the murder of the Clutter family in 1959, and I did not expect it to be so interesting. I mean, I should have. It's considered a novel that poured gasoline on the spark of interest that the country had in true crime. And now look at it. Podcasts, TV shows, and movies, and the whole 9 yards. Before we get going with it, this is your reminder to subscribe. And wherever you like to listen to podcasts, this podcast is available there. And connect with 10-Minute Murder on social media as well. Links are in the show notes of this episode, also at 10minutemurder.com. Now to the story. If you're wondering why this murder shocked America the way that it did, I mean, in the light of serial killers from the 80s and the 21st century school shootings, this crime doesn't seem to be so isolated. The answer is the timing of the killing. In 1959 America, people were recovering from the trauma of the Second World War. Everyone was convinced that the violence was over, and they entered the era of being safe, looking forward to times of prosperity and security. And no one expected this level of unjustified brutality just out of the blue in an isolated rural area. Capote recalled the local detective's words, "Of all the people in the world, the Clutters were the least likely to be murdered." Everyone in Holcomb knew the Clutters, especially Herb, the father of four daughters and husband of Bonnie, who was the president of the National Association of Wheat Growers. Maybe it doesn't sound as impressive today, but mind you, a title like that really meant something in those days before the mass production of farming and corporations. Herb was heavily involved in the Methodist community, actively involved in schools, hospitals, and churches. He earned himself a reputation as being a social butterfly, an influential figure. He became known as the town's most remarkable social entrepreneur. Herbert Clutter employed 18 people on his farm, and each and every single one of his employees praised him for his honesty and good pay. Richard Hickok, or Dick, was born in Kansas, and he was 28 years old during the time of the Clutters murder. Dick, opposite to Perry Smith, had a rather normal childhood. His farm worker parents provided for him and his siblings with a good upbringing, but they were pretty strict. He was a popular student and promising athlete. He went on to work as a mechanic instead of attending college due to his family's lack of money. Dick had a disfigured face because of an almost fatal automobile accident, which left him with a head injury. Medical bills caused mounting debts, which were impossible to pay off right away, even in the 1950s. It led him down the criminal path as he started forging checks and gambling to make ends meet. Perry Smith was born in Nevada, and he was 31 years old when he performed the multiple killings. His parents were rodeo performers. While living in Alaska, Perry's father abused his family, which resulted in Mr. Smith's wife leaving him. She moved along with the kids to San Francisco. Unfortunately, the life of Perry and his siblings did not improve. as their alcoholic mother choked on her own vomit when Perry was just 13 years old. The children were placed in a Catholic orphanage where they were supposedly malnourished and abused physically and mentally by the nuns. After being placed in a Salvation Army orphanage, Perry's living conditions didn't get any better. He says that the caretakers tried to drown him. Later, he reunited with his father and they lived a vagabond life together. Due to this trauma, he fell by the wayside and joined a street gang, performing his first crimes. What's even worse is that his father and 2 of his siblings committed suicide, and the remaining sister cut ties with Perry. At the age of 16, Perry Smith joined the United States Merchant Marine, which is not part of the military, but it is incredibly important to the armed forces. Later, he did join the Army and served in the Korean War. After earning a Bronze Star, he retired from the service with an honorable discharge in 1952, in spite of getting into fights with other soldiers and Korean civilians. In March of 1956, he was sentenced after being found guilty of breaking and entering. It was there, in the Kansas State Penitentiary, that Perry Smith met Dick Hickok. While in prison, they were told by a former River Valley Farms worker, a cellmate, Floyd Wells, that Mr. Clutter kept thousands of dollars in a cash safe in his house. This information ignited the criminals' imagination, who were jobless and broke after being released from prison. They hoped that one heist would provide them with $10,000, which is equivalent to more than $100,000 today. Floyd recalled that he said something like, "Herb Clutter is rich and spends almost $10,000 a year on the farm." But the criminal mastermind duo misconstrued the story. They believed that Clutter kept a vast amount of cash in his house at all times. In reality, he was a very frequent check writer and kept almost no cash in the house. Funny enough, he even wrote a check for $1 to pay for a haircut. Even though the crime rates in his hometown were extremely low, he was outstandingly cautious with money. Dick and Perry set off on more than 400 miles of a journey, craving the Clutters' cash. They silently broke into the Clutters' house, entering through an unlocked door. They pushed Herb's children, Nancy and Kenyon, into the bathroom on the second floor. Later, then took Herb to his office on the first floor and questioned him about the money. When he informed them that there was no cash in the house, they didn't believe him and conducted a search themselves. With every minute, as they were realizing what Herb said was true and that there was no safe, they started to panic. They got frustrated and eventually decided to act out on an innocent family, intending to eliminate witnesses of the burglary at the same time. When they left the farmhouse, leaving behind the bodies of the Clutter parents and their 2 younger children, Perry and Dick took with them all the cash that Herb had on him, about $40, as well as Kenyon's portable radio and a pair of Herb's binoculars. On November 15, 1959, the police were notified by the Clutter family friends that 4 bodies had been found at their house on River Valley Farm. Detectives who participated in the inspection agreed that what they saw was beyond their imagination. All victims were tied up and murdered with a headshot fired at close range. Mr. Clutter had also had his throat cut. Nancy and her mother were murdered upstairs in their bedrooms. Kenyon was killed sleeping in the living room. Mr. Clutter's body was found on a cardboard mattress box in the boiler room. And why had no one heard these 4 shots and called the police that night? Well, River Valley Farms was off the beaten track, on the outskirts of Holcomb, so the shots fired during the execution were not heard by anyone. Dick and Perry cut the telephone lines leading into the house before the murders, and then afterward took the spent shotgun shells with them. There were hardly any traces of them other than the bloody footprints. The policemen were sure that they were dealing with a carefully planned crime. About 1,000 mourners attended the Clutter family funeral. Taking into account the population of Holcomb was something around 200 in 1959, it clearly shows how the Clutter family was well known, respected, and missed by many. Perry and Dick were on the run, living off of forged checks for about 6 weeks before they were arrested in Las Vegas, Nevada on December 30th. It was Floyd Wells who had told the investigators about Hickok's plan to rob and murder the Clutters, the same person who told him about the Clutters in the first place. Perry and Dick were found guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death by hanging. On the final evening of their lives, Dick Hickok and Perry Smith ordered a last meal of spiced shrimp as a main dish with ice cream and strawberry shortcake for dessert. They were both executed in April of 1965 at the Kansas State Prison. Hickok was the first to enter the gallows as a result of winning a coin toss held by prison officials. Dick said, Well, I'll be damned. This is the first thing I've ever won in my life. The murderers were buried side by side at Mount Muncie Cemetery in Lansing. Interestingly, Truman Capote paid for a small headstone to be placed on their graves. And what did he have to do with all of this? How did Capote end up being so involved with the criminals? When the killings made the national news, Truman Capote, who was already well known for the breakfast at Tiffany's, decided to chronicle the event. He left New York and traveled more than 1,500 miles west across the country. At first, the killers were taken aback by a flamboyant, short man with a funny, high-pitched, squeaky voice, and they didn't take him seriously. They were also pretty intimidated by a famous man from a big city. Nevertheless, Truman Capote succeeded in befriending the killers. He spent a couple of months going through the police records, conducting interviews, and recording accounts of the townspeople. 6 years after conducting his in-depth research, his findings were published in the book In Cold Blood. Making Holcomb known all around the globe for this tragedy was not the only thing Truman Capote was criticized for. There were rumors that he fell in love with Perry Smith after spending long hours interviewing him. Truman Capote was openly gay and admitted to being fascinated by Perry Smith. Capote found him to be a polite dreamer with an artistic soul, which is kind of strange to say about a cold-blooded murderer. That's today's 10-Minute Murder. Brief and bingeable true crime. Thank you for listening today, and I did not spoil the book for you, by the way. That was going through my head about halfway through telling you the whole story. Like, they're going to think I spoiled the book. I didn't, right? We know who killed the Clutter family. That's known information. I just basically detailed their lives in a very brief way. And the book goes into so much detail. It's not a short book at all. It's very detailed and thorough, and it goes through way more than I could talk about here. I mean, if I were to talk about the whole story, and I would basically just be reading the book to you, and it would take me like 10 hours to do that. And obviously, I can't do that. I just summed up a 10-hour audiobook into maybe 12 hours. I just summed it up into about 10 or 11 minutes. So you're not missing anything by listening to this podcast if you want to go and read the book. It's very good. Hey, again, thank you for listening today. And if you have not yet subscribed, please subscribe to 10-Minute Murder and also connect to 10-Minute Murder on social media. All links are found at 10minutemurder.com. Thank you for listening. Be safe and make good choices.